to this. And now we will go to, let's see if I can, right. Tonight we're talking about John Ruskin's Guild of St. George, and also broaching the idea of our conference, City in the Book 10, on Florence and India. And we have some wonderful guests participating with us. We're going to begin first with the Pre-Raphaelites with Nick Peeters in Brussels, then to talk about John Ruskin and the Guild of St. George with Arjun, Shivaji, Zain in Delhi, and talking also about the Indian prince's tomb here in Florence, a bit of a discourse on science and art and the arts and crafts movement, and then we'll have John Haley III from Colorado talking about being a blacksmith after having been my student in medieval studies. And then I will give a bit about our life here in this cemetery, living out Ruskin's concepts. And next slide is Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the PRB, 1848, William Holman Hunt. You remember, he sculpts his wife's tomb here in this cemetery. John Everett Millais and Dante Gabriel Rossetti and others, and later Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris joining them. A movement which grew out of and in opposition to the Royal Academy of Art. At first it had to be secret, and it was much shaped and supported by John Ruskin. All right, Nick Peeters, can you take over?
Yes. So the Pre-Raphaelites, they called themselves Pre-Raphaelites because they wanted to return to a more pure and a more honest way of painting, and they found their inspiration for that in late medieval Italian painting, and they were championed by the art critic John Ruskin. John Ruskin was a very influential art critic, and it was thanks to him that the Pre-Raphaelites became accepted, because before that they had to endure a lot of criticism from, by example, Charles Dickens, who gave a very, very negative review of the painting we are looking at the moment, Christ in the House of His Parents by John Millais. Maybe we could have a look at the next slide. This is a very famous painting. It's by John Millais. It's, of course, Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet, and the model was Elizabeth Siddal. This was a very, very revolutionary painting because it was, as John Ruskin advised young painters, very true to nature. The representation of the plants and the flowers is almost photographic. Lizzie Siddal, as she was known, was the sweetheart and later on the wife of Millais' friend, Millais' Pre-Raphaelite brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Lizzie Siddal often modeled for Dante Gabriel Rossetti, but she was also an artist in her own right. But we'll go into that later. Oh, voila, here we are. This is one of her pictures, the quest for the Holy Grail. As you can see, although she never had formal training, Rossetti did teach her quite a lot. She was a very accomplished artist in her own right. Next slide, maybe. Yeah, and Elizabeth Siddal was certainly the first woman artist in the Pre-Raphaelite circle, but after her, that circle opened itself to many more female artists. This one, for instance, Marie Spartali-Stillman, was also a model for the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, but also for several painters in the Pre-Raphaelite circle. As you can see, she too was a very accomplished artist. Unlike Lizzie Siddal, she managed to exhibit many of her paintings, and recently she was rediscovered thanks to, well, she was rediscovered by a larger audience thanks to an exhibition organized at the Delaware Art Museum. Maybe we could have a look at the next slide. This is Aurora Triumphans by Evelyn de Morgan. Evelyn de Morgan is, of course, my favorite Pre-Raphaelite woman artist. I wrote my PhD dissertation about her several years ago now. Evelyn de Morgan was not just a painter, she was also a spiritualist, and she was a feminist, and both these aspects of her personality are very often integrated in her paintings. Definitely, she was the most accomplished woman artist in the Pre-Raphaelite circle because she was among the first generation of women artists to receive a good and complete art education, and this was at the Slade School of Arts. And Evelyn was one of the first students, female students there. And it was thanks to the very liberal policy of the professors at the Slade that women were also allowed to draw from the nude, and that was why you can see that she had a much better grasp of the human anatomy than the painters we've just seen, like Marie Spartali-Stillman and Elizabeth Siddal. Another interesting fact about Evelyn de Morgan is that her cousin Mary Spencer Stanhope is buried at Julius Cemetery, and the grave monument was designed by Evelyn de Morgan's uncle, the artist, the Pre-Raphaelite artist, John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, who lived in Florence until he died there in 1908. It's interesting to know that Evelyn de Morgan had a Pre-Raphaelite artist as her uncle, because it was thanks to him that her parents, thanks to his influence, that her parents let her study at the Slade and that she became an artist.
Thank you, Nick.
Maybe we could have a look at the next slide. Yes. And of course, apart from painting, there were in the Pre-Raphaelite circle quite a few women who were excellent at arts and crafts. And here we see the work of two of these women artists who worked for William Morris. William Morris, who was, of course, a great artist, poet, and socialist, and a follower of John Ruskin. The work of art on the left is an embroidered linen with colored silks. It's a bed cover by Catherine Holliday, an embroiderer who regularly worked for William Morris and who actually, through her stitching, added very much of her own influence and ideas to the designs made by William Morris. Let me have a look at my notes for a moment. She was the wife of the Pre-Raphaelite painter Henry Holiday, and Henry Holiday was, of course, also very well known as a designer of stained glass. And then the piano here, which is also at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A, it was decorated by Kate Faulkner, who also worked at the firm of William Morris. And this is decorated with gesso after a design by Edward Burne-Jones, Morris's great friend and also one of the later Pre-Raphaelite painters. And we must definitely point out, I must definitely point out that Kate Faulkner added quite a lot of her own ideas to Edward Burne-Jones's design. I once gave a lecture at London University about several women who worked for William Morris and who were actually great artists in their own right. Among them were, of course, his wife, Jane Morris, who was also a model very, very often for Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and his daughter, May Morris, should definitely not be forgotten. She too was a great designer and embroiderer. Let me have another moment to think. Yes, and there is one last Pre-Raphaelite arts and crafts artists that we should not forget, and that is Kate Faulkner's sister, Lucy Faulkner, who, among several other things, painted tiles for William Morris. Will that suffice, Julia?
Nick, it's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it.
I did. And I wanted to add, this was my children's favorite painting in the National Gallery in London, the Pisanello Vision of St. Eustace. And it's the international style at the end of the Middle Ages. And this is something which you get an evocation of with the Millet Ophelia, the sense of nature abounding. I just wanted to add that. These are a few of the earls that you can consult on this material. The Church of St. Mark's here in Florence was decorated by Holman Hunt and Spencer Stanhope, also the Trinity, Holy Trinity Church. Now we come to John Ruskin, who at 13 in 1830 was given Samuel Rogers' Italy with Turner's illustrations, and then went on to write Modern Painters, lauding Turner and Truth to Nature. And in 1845, when he was 26, he was sketching in Pisa's Camposanto when Elizabeth Barrett and Browning were eloping there. And he, of course, championed the Pre-Raphaelites. He was a socialist, but at the same time, he did have a sort of class consciousness about him. He worked with Frederick James Furnivall, who I work with a lot because Furnivall was editing medieval texts, the Early English Text Society. They were establishing the Working Men's College. And in 1871, he founds the Guild of St. George. He also supports Francis Alexander, who's buried in the other cemetery here, who did wonderful drawings of the contadini in Tuscany. Now we turn this over to, I'm just going to mention the scandal of his wife, who left him to marry instead Millet. And this is Millet painting Ruskin's portrait, and then also painting his wife as the model Ephigray and so on. Now we should turn this over to Arjun. Can you chime in, Arjun?
Thank you, Julia. And everybody, hello. A very good evening to all of you there in Italy. It is, of course, midnight here in Delhi, way past time. But I am very glad to be here. And could we have the next slide, please, Julia, where you have that lovely photograph of me from Spain. So I had been working as a salesman, in fact, for a month in Gijón on the northern coast of Spain in 2017. This is where this photograph is from. It was a I have very fond memories of the trip. It was my last overseas trip, in fact, with my father. So it's quite memorable for me. Can we have the next slide? But I have been asked by Julia to speak a bit about the Guild of St. George. Now, as mentioned by Julia, this was established by John Ruskin in 1871. It began life, of course, not as the Guild of St. George, but the St. George's Company. And in my opinion, it came about because of a very earnest desire of John Ruskin to finally start putting into practice the kind of philosophy he had been developing over the years. From art critic supreme in his younger days, I would say he was acting as cultural minister for the entire United Kingdom. And perhaps given the sort of influence the UK had on the rest of the world then, perhaps cultural minister for the entire world. Much like the poet Percy Shelley, he was of the opinion that art was for the moral perfection of man. His initiation, his development of the company was because he wanted to do this practically. We read of road building projects, construction of schools were very much amongst Ruskin's plans of the company, most of which plans, unfortunately, did have to remain unfulfilled in his life. Julia briefly mentioned the infamous scandal that Ruskin was associated with. And towards the end of his life, he did face, sadly, a number of emotional and mental disturbances. But anyway, not all his plans were unfulfilled. So many people have been influenced by Ruskin's thoughts: Leo Tolstoy, Marcel Proust, Mahatma Gandhi. And in fact, I do think that my own country, India, did gain its independence because Gandhi read Ruskin's Unto This Lost. I read it myself in 2015 or 16, and it completely changed my life. The first thing I did after I returned from the UK was to start my own John Ruskin manufactory here in Delhi. And we can do the previous slide, Julia. This is something not there. Yeah. So yes, it is very much still there, the Guild, however. It is very much still there. A charity, an arts and crafts charity, rural economy. Never any construction projects, but it is a companionship. We have about 320 companions worldwide, and we do hold conferences. The Guild does publish books, does have some land in the Wire Forest in the UK, which I was very fortunate to be invited to, and also maintains the Ruskin collection in Sheffield. I've got to say at this point that I was elected as the Young Companions representative. Not many young companions, I'm sad to say, in the Guild, but I am their representative. Next slide, please. How I became a member of the Guild is a very interesting story. I had no idea of John Ruskin until 5 years ago. I had a very long love affair with Eastern Europe. However, in 2016, I went to Yasnaya Polyana, a village 200 kilometers south of Moscow. This is where Leo Tolstoy was born, the Russian author. And amongst the very few English books that were there in the library there, I found a monograph by the communications officer of the Guild, then Stuart Eagles, on Ruskin and Tolstoy. Not his book, I couldn't find the cover, but Stuart Eagles, which led me on to the Ruskin land, this piece of land the Guild owns in Wire Forest. I read Ruskin's Unto This Lost, and as I said, it changed my life completely, which in fact then led me on to Mahatma Gandhi. A very unconventional way, I would say, of moving on to Gandhi, but that is how I came about him, and which was instrumental in my returning to India. I had no intention of doing that, but I am very much staying put in Delhi now, mainly out of mainly out of a discipleship of Gandhi, I would say. His philosophy of Swadeshi, of locality, is very much a part of how I look at things. The painting on the right is the original, I think, 1847 cover of Ruskin's Seven Lamps of Architecture. And I replaced all the Latin names of the lamps with their equivalents in Hindustani. But the background design is, in fact, after a floor in Florence, in one of Florence's basilicas. Julia, if you can remind me of the name, I don't remember it.
San Miniato.
Have you seen it in person?
Yes.
Maybe you should send me a photograph sometime. Next slide, please. So very exciting, the proposed conference, the Florence and Delhi conference that we are trying to do next April. The second half of the conference will be held in Delhi. April the 23rd is when we've marked our calendars for it. And a little bit about it. It is not at all Pre-Raphaelite, not at all Ruskinian, not at all Mauritian. You will find none of that here. But it is an ancient city, much like Rome. And legend has it, it was built and rebuilt 7 times, the last being by the British, which was when New Delhi was born. It is a city of cities, amongst the largest metropolises in the world. And I looked this up this evening. Overall, it has a population of about half of Italy. Can you believe it? Next slide, please. But this is very much Mauritian. This is my little corner in Delhi, where I have been working for the last 5 years. Was my father's factory, and which, along with my sister, we've converted into a cultural center. We are calling it the Red House, after William Morris's own Red House in Bexley Heath. And the architecture is very much inspired by Ruskin's 7 Lamps. We do events every weekend. In fact, this last weekend, we screened a film, a very beautiful Russian French film, Polina, along with some dance performances. But I would like to invite you all, if you can, to Delhi in April next year, and you are very welcome to spend time with me at the Red House. Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. Right, and now we turn to what Ruskin was objecting to, the industrialization of artifacts, things made by machines instead of manually created. This is the Crystal Palace of 1851, and the major sculpture at the center of it is the Greek slave that was sculpted by the American Hiram Powers, who's buried here, to which Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote an impassioned sonnet against slavery. And she came from a slave-owning family. And now we turn to the tomb here in Florence. It's not a tomb, it's a monument. A young Indian Raja unfortunately died at the age of 20 while having also visited Queen Victoria and so forth. But he met his demise here in Florence, and they had to hurriedly figure out how to do the Indian form of honoring the dead by having a pyre. He was burned where the 2 rivers joined together, the Arno and the Mugnone, in the park called the Cascine, about which Shelley wrote his Ode to the West Wind. And the sculptor is actually born in India, Major Charles Mant, and he's using the Muslim style of architecture. Because we remember before the British partitioned India, it was a multicultural society where Muslim and Hindu lived side by side. Here we see a photograph of what it was like in the 19th century, just after it was built, the two ladies with parasols. And then it was in very bad shape with one of these iron columns. Typically, this modern architecture is of iron and then glass and later plastic, whereas what the other form of architecture, the medieval form, tended to be wood and stone. But we have this beautiful dome inside with the sense of the celestial spheres, which you also get in the Pazzi Chapel, where it actually does the astrology of the Pazzi family. And I wanted to talk a bit about science and art. The Industrial Revolution and next sanctions against fascism increased the use of metal and glass and left brain linearity and the cost-cutting cheapness of the box in architecture. Instead, the Pre-Raphaelites and then the Liberty style sought nature's more complex circles and spirals, her Fibonacci curves and fractals. Neuroscience, Ian McGilchrist, the master and his emissary, speaking about this as of greater value. The prince's tomb is made of iron, which decayed, being near the two rivers, the Arno and the Mugnoni, for the scattering of his ashes. But it uses the volutes of Muslim architecture, known by the Indian-born British architect who built it. It's a Victorian eclectic amalgam of styles. William Blake used the left brain lintel and post architecture of Stonehenge to signify despair and evil, the more nature-complying Gothic, also beloved by John Ruskin and Evelyn Underhill, for what was hopeful and good in his illustrations to the Book of Job. And here you see the Gothic cathedral, and here you see Stonehenge for the Book of Job. And also we have, let's see if I can move that now, the arts and crafts movement, William Morris's typesetting of John Ruskin's The Nature of Gothic. Here we get the Bessarion fresco I always use for our now 27th Zoom discussion, and the Fibonacci curves and fractals. This particular fractal is actually called by my name, Julia. And the British Library was a circle. Now it's sort of square boxes, the same that also happened to Paris's Bibliothèque Nationale. The previous architecture was more natural and also shaped like the human brain. And here we get Dante organizing the bulges and terraces and so forth of the Inferno. And this is the pulpit by Donatello in Pisa. Again, this rounding that our Daniel, our restorer, who is Roma, helped restore. And he was bringing pieces of the metal home that were Renaissance pieces to mend on my kitchen stove. And but science itself is now drawing away from the Darwinian left brain linear concept of progress. My own sense of science is that it should be carried out with humility and wonder, not from the desire to control and have power, but to use that energy the least possible so as not to deplete it. I was taught science in college by a nuclear physicist who got his doctorate from the Atomic Energy Commission, and I witnessed at 17 an atomic above-ground explosion at 40 miles distance from Dante's viewpoint in Death Valley. Arjun began his academic career as a nuclear scientist, and I'm so proud of the way he has converted instead to Ruskin's concepts. The new science, that was Giambattista Vico's title to his book about spirals, which very much influenced James Joyce in history, is that of astronomy, teaching us humility and wonder, and also genetics, where plants have more complex genetic coding than we do. I was delighted this morning reading this on the octopus that creates a paper-thin Fibonacci curving nautilus shell in which to hatch its eggs.
Oh, wow.
No, it's extraordinary. Japanese scientists were investigating this. I do advise reading it. It's wonderful. And then yesterday, I was likewise delighted that a former student came. He's now 54 and I 85. He was telling me of his iron forging in the forest of Brocéliande, which actually exists, although it features in so many Breton romances. This is John Haley III, his father, a rocket scientist, he a craftsman, traveling worldwide and reviving blacksmithing in Liberty style. He gave me this Ouroboros, and I showed him the Ouroboros sculpted in marble on one of our eclectic Victorian tombs, borrowing from the Egyptians as well as the Greeks and the Romans, a wonderful mixture. Okay, John, can you speak now? John Haley, I think you're present and you could unmute yourself and speak.
There we go. I think it's working now.
Yes.
Oh, great. I've only done a handful of Zoom meetings, so I'm kind of green at this.
Me too.
So shall I just speak briefly about my,
Yes.
so to speak?
Yes.
Well, I stumbled into blacksmithing almost 30 years ago after floundering with art in various mediums and various focuses that just didn't ever really grab me until I just happened to come across a blacksmith in the mountains of Colorado that needed a helper, potentially an apprentice. So I ended up apprenticing for 3 years with him. He was kind of a traditional blacksmith, but definitely inspired a lot of ideas that I'd had with other mediums of art that I just couldn't really find my voice with. So I found that forging metal was my calling, so to speak, and I've been pursuing that nonstop since, and have, as a result, been able to travel the world and do blacksmithing events, primarily in France and Belgium and the Czech Republic. And now I'm hoping to find some blacksmithing connections in Italy, because that's my current obsession, is learning Italian.
Join the club.
Oh, well, in my work, I do definitely try to take it's basically an homage to the Art Nouveau movement with maybe a little more modern interpretation. I think when the Art Nouveau movement happened, it was a celebration of the feminine and nature. And at that point, I think we were getting along fairly well with nature, but 120 years later, I try to do the same thing, but celebrate nature, but nature's a little more, it's kind of rebelling, shall we say. So it's a little like Art Nouveau with an edge, but it's kind of, the work itself is for me, a very spiritual thing, where I'm out there improvising based on the golden mean and Fibonacci and sacred geometry, and it's a very spiritual practice for me, and it is hard work. But as I've gotten older, the work's getting finer and finer, because I just don't like working the big material as much as I once did. It's becoming almost turning into jewelry at this point.
Splendid. And here's an example of an earlier use of metal, which I love, because you can see the exuberance of the natural forms and the playfulness, which machines don't have when they create things. They're not really creating, they're just doing things, cheaply. It's the opposite. And I wanted to mention that my restorer here in the cemetery, who was brilliant, who was invited to work on the Donatello pulpit, here he has done the facsimile of the Libro del Chiodo with the metal. We went into the state archives to look at the original to get it right. And he worked with Enrico Giannini, who's Florentine. Daniel is Roma from Romania. And they both of them learned their crafts when they were children from their parents. I also learned carpentry from my foster father. Okay, there's somebody wanting to come in. Yes, welcome. And it's like with languages. If you learn as a child a language or a skill, it is much easier than learning it too late in life. Here is Enrico Giannini, who taught me bookbinding, and here's Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu. And I was asked to take this photograph of them by UNESCO because they wanted examples of UNESCO work here in Florence for their 40th anniversary. What I find interesting is that there were several movements going on at once in England during this time, all of them resisting industrialization. Anglo-Catholicism, medievalism, and so forth, the Pre-Raphaelites, the Italian Risorgimento, which was very much supported by the English, by Elizabeth Barrett Browning and others. And my Anglican convent school had begun in the Pre-Raphaelites' Red Lion Square and was imbued with Ruskin's concepts. Our mother foundress, Agnes Mason, wrote into her rule that a sin against beauty is a sin against the Holy Ghost, and I really believe that. She bought this house that was half built by Augustus Hare, who was a Victorian travel writer who wrote a very fine book about Florence. And this is his drawing of the Bargello. And then this is what he designed around his house with the statue of Queen Anne that he actually bought from London because they threw it out, the original statue, for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And it was in the garden, and we asked to repair it, and the trust said no. And they decapitated all of the figures. And this is what tends to happen today. The lack of care, which Tavia Hill with her National Trusts was trying to prevent. And similar to Ruskin's attempts to aid women artists, the Royal Drawing Society was founded in 1888 with the assistance of Lord Leighton, Sir John Millais and Sir Edward Burne-Jones to encourage children's drawings with certificates. And I won several of these as a schoolgirl in Sussex. So when I was 20, I was sketching the Michelangelo Pieta during Mass in the Duomo, where it was them holding my 18-month-old child in my arms. And John Ruskin loved the Venetian architecture, the Venetian Gothic. This is me on my bicycle in Florence. I've been very much shaped by Ruskin, and even to the extent of actually coming to live here. And then the English cemetery. We earlier discussed how the English cemetery is oval with its two hemispheres, is like the human brain, and discussed as well the great Victorian libraries in London and Paris, having the same circular and hemispheric shapes, now repudiated into glass square boxes. While in the cemetery's garden, we carry out landscaping with Florence's wild purple irises, her lily, and restore the marble and iron of her tombs, no longer using this weed killer. I modelled her library on the Bodleians and carry out Ruskinian arts and crafts with building its bookshelves and cradles, hand-binding books that I print in William Morris type and bind with marble paper. And I sew my own clothes while living with my manually skilled workers who are Roma from India 1,000 years ago. Here's the Bodleian Library where my father went to work as an orphan at 14, fetching books for people like Yeats. And it has these wonderful metal shapes at the joins. And so we copied them for our library. And this is how I shaped, because I knew carpentry, the shelves, wasting very little wood. And the pieces that we do have left over, we give to children with sandpapers to make blocks. These are the lily crosses we use at the joints of our shelves, modelled on the Bodleian. And also those shelves go all the way along, so they don't sag because they're supported in the middle here. And we use very little wood. And we also make cradles. And this is the library downstairs. And this is another view of it. And again, we have this painting by a Norwegian art student who showed up, who'd only been taught how to paint black paintings about death and didn't know how to stretch a canvas or to make a frame or to gold leaf. And so I taught him, because my family were artists and they taught me when I was young. And this is the upstairs part of the library with the Greek, Latin and Italian books. And downstairs we hold school for the Roma, who all of them except Daniel were illiterate and could not even write their name, but knew how to hammer nails, how to do everything very efficiently manually. That was a Zoita saying of a children's illustrated Dante, che bello. And another Roma family we have, the nurturing of the children. And I believe you do have cradles in library, despite what Eloise said, Abelard. She showed up with her baby. I made a marsupial for the baby so she could garden. Her husband was in prison and she was only allowed out for a few hours a day from social assistance. She's an absolutely lovely girl. And here are the books that we make. This is in God's Image one that we did for the Academia Bessarion. The marble paper. I love the colours, the effects. No piece is exactly the same. They're not machine made. And you use organic materials, ox gall and Irish seaweed, Aberdeen moss. And the sewing frame and the press are from my convent from the 19th century, because the sisters were banned from their mother study her translation of St. Teresa of Avila's Foundations. And more of these, and here I am sewing. And that tablecloth came from Cluj in Romania, hand embroidered. And this is the Bessarion design from the fresco in the Casina Bessarioni, and more of that. And this is Markham Guite's poetry on Dante, and I made this edition in the William Morris type, limited edition. And this one, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry, English and Italian, of the sonnets in the Portuguese, and her sonnet against slavery to the Greek slave, which was the very center of the Crystal Palace. And then Holman Hunt sculpted the tomb for Fanny, and the carousel with my grandson Luke. This is the roundness of his recalling his wife's pregnant belly. She died following childbirth because they didn't know to wash their hands when they were delivering babies. And I love this sculpture of Della Robbia, of the young Mary and the elderly Elizabeth greeting each other, both of them laughing because they're both pregnant. And also I feel as a carpenter, you need to build cradles and also coffins. I have built mine, and I haven't built it as elegantly as Desmond Tutu's. Mine, I'm afraid, of needing to be cheap, is just a box. But nevertheless, these are the cradles we make almost wholesale for our Roma babies. This is my first Roma baby whom I baptized and made my first cradle for. This is the library and the clothes that I sew and so forth. And here we see the mixture of herder on the donkey with a solar panel and his cell phone. Have you noticed how ugly electronic equipment is? Metal and so forth. Although it can show these marvelous human images in color and so on. It's a strange paradox that we're living with. So now we can stop the screen sharing and discuss. Here we have the gallery. You can all unmute and all make comments. And thank you for those splendid contributions, Nick and Arjun and John. I'm so grateful to you. Right.
And thank you, Julia.
Did it make sense?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I think Ruskin makes sense, but I think it's very difficult for the commercial world to see that. The way we've had access to this small, well, square in Florence, but it's circular, it's oval. And we've been able ecologically to compost instead of using chemicals. And the topsoil has increased and it has become very beautiful instead of being ugly. And it's actually made a lot of money for its owners because it became beautiful. A strange paradox that this is a better form of commerce, I think. Phil, do you have a comment? Phil is from Iceland, on Iceland. And he's one of my former students.
Yeah, it's former student in Colorado, like John. And yeah, I wanted to say thank you to Nick and Arjun and John and Julia for your presentations. I really enjoyed them. And also, yes, also another nuclear science link, because my father was a nuclear physicist too. So,
Yeah,
and
yes.
I think he actually did some work on the Apollo rocket engines too. So there's a rocket scientist in there too. But I can just make a kind of a little maybe a little bit of a spiral comment here, because it's interesting, because I had some bad news in my family. My brother-in-law has to have a stem cell transplant because of multiple myeloma.
Yeah.
But that just led me to reading more about the actress and model Lisa Ray, who has very strong ties with India. She's acted in a lot of Bollywood movies there and things like this. And Lisa Ray wrote about her experiences with myeloma, because she too had a stem cell transplant, and she's cancer-free now. But I was reading more and more about her, and reading about her poetry. These days, she's writing more poetry. She's sort of becoming a stronger voice of poetry and for poets. And while I was reading her poetry, I got Julia's email about this session, and I looked up Arjun's web page, and I started to read about your poetry and art there. And so it got me wondering if you were familiar with Lisa Ray at all and her poetry. And also, I just noticed that about last week, a few days ago, she interviewed the Indian writer Ruskin Bond. I don't know if you're familiar with him either. And so I was doing a little bit of reading about him, and apparently he's very celebrated for his celebration of nature. Yeah. So I just found that sort of an interesting little link, all these sort of conjunctions. And so, yeah, that I just wanted to know if you had heard of Lisa Ray, Arjun, or Ruskin Bond, and so
Ruskin,
maybe some voices there for you.
oh, very, very interesting. Ruskin Bond, I had, of course, heard of, and Lisa Ray. I don't think I've seen any of her films. I might have, I don't know. But Ruskin Bond, I did read as a child. It's very lovely children's books as well. He lives in the foothills of the Himalayas, and it's very hard to meet him. It seems he has adopted a family, or perhaps the family has adopted him in the hills there. But yes, Ruskin Bond is a very fine person. Almost everyone here in India knows about him.
Okay.
But thank you very much for Lisa Ray's poetry. I will look her up. I will read some of hers. Do you have any specific recommendations?
No, I was looking at her website, and she has a section there with a lot of poetry, and she's writing more and more poetry now. And I wrote down one of her, not a line of poetry, but a statement she made. She said, "So I started thinking about a revolution, a world without the pathology of perfection, without an unrealistic and painful belief system that we are entitled to get through life without suffering." So I thought this was a very nice statement at first. And so when I heard about, I don't know, the connection between Florence and India, and if you're looking for other voices, she might be someone you might be interested in talking to, because poetry seems to be so much more important to her now. So yeah, and I always really found your website very interesting too, and I keep looking, and I'll have to read some Ruskin Bond also. So yes, yeah.
Yes, we had a course by John Wheeler called Physics for Poets, and it was a very, very popular course. John Hills, are you a companion of John Ruskin, or how did you find us? Could you unmute? John Hills.
Yes, there we go. Kirsten, who's a Quaker in Florence, who you know very well, I think, Julia, she forwarded me your link for this evening's presentation, which I found very, very interesting. It's covered a lot of my own interests and some of occasion my travels to India and following in the, well, seeking to follow in the footsteps of Gandhi. Not very successfully, but you know, I'm a Quaker, so I'm trying. And it's true that our world is not valuing beauty, is not valuing companionship, is not valuing fellowship, is not valuing the kind of spiritual values that make for interconnection and integration. I find those values through Quaker worship and through my practice as a psychotherapist. But all the time one feels a kind of outcast thrown into the world that is not always on one's own wavelength, but there we go. But it's through art. I'm not familiar with the writings of John Ruskin, although as an adolescent, I was very enamored of William Wordsworth's work and loved the lakes. But Ruskin, I'm afraid, is someone to explore.
What I'm hoping is that I found there's a wonderful bookseller in Delhi who did a beautiful edition, facsimile edition of Joseph Garrow's first translation into English of Dante's Vita Nova. Joseph Garrow was the son of an Indian princess. And I would love to find this bookseller. I've sort of asked Arjun if he could check this out and ask if they could do a facsimile edition of the wonderful many volume set of John Ruskin's writings, because I think we need to have them available again. I cherish them on my father's bookshelves. They were very beautiful books, edited extremely well. And I think it would be good for the commerce of Delhi to be marketing these excellent books for libraries worldwide. Laura, do you have a comment? Could you?
I just want to thank you, Julia. I talk to Julia fairly often, and I was with her a couple of months ago in Florence, which was an amazing treat. And I'm learning all the time from her. Every phone conversation, I should be just taking notes. So I'm happy you record these sessions because I can go back and look things up that go by a little too quickly. But I have one question because I really don't know the answer to this. Where does the word Pre-Raphaelite come from?
Right.
Anybody can answer that for me. It would be great.
It was their desire. It was the medievalist movement, going back. Art had become very sort of mannered and academic. Raphael, there's something I find, I appreciate Giotto and so forth, but Raphael has a kind of sentimentality at the same time as just being too. I can't explain it. I just don't like it. But when you go through the Uffizi, the first rooms are the paintings that used to be in the churches for older people, and they're beautiful with gold leaf backgrounds, women saints, and so on. Then as you go further up through time, you get the big brown backgrounds, you get pornography, and that's the art for the palaces, for the people with power. Whereas the art of the people, Dante was writing for the people. That's where you find the beauty. You don't find it in the bastions. You find it where there's a common energy that's shared, common humanity. And I think that's what the Pre-Raphaelites were working towards. They are a bit paradoxical because there were all of these love affairs going on between them, quite scandalous and so forth. Holman Hunt marry his wife's sister to raise a baby when his wife died following childbirth, and this was against the law in England, and they had to marry in Switzerland, and finally the Queen did forgive him. There was a scandal of Ruskin's marriage. There was a scandal of Morris's marriage with Zain having her affair also with Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But at the same time, they were painting scenes of the gospel, painting scenes of carpenter shops. You had the Millet of Jesus as a boy in the carpenter's shop. You also have a very fine painting like that by Holman Hunt and so on. Holman Hunt does the one of the light of the world, Jesus with the lantern, and that lantern still exists. It was a real artifact and so on. Does that explain it? It's a kind of hankering for a better past, a more artisanal past, the word artigiani, arts and crafts, and so forth. I don't think
Thank you.
come up with a better explanation. You're the expert on the.
But did they name themselves that?
Did they? Yes.
Is that
Yes,
what
they
they
did.
call themselves? Okay.
Mhm. They signed themselves PRB, Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
Wow. Okay.
Rebellion against the academics who, everything had become too conventionalized, too mechanized, and they were wanting to go back to the real nature and the real human beings. And often their models were, speaking Cockney. For instance, Dante Gabriel Rossetti couldn't take Lizzie back to his parents because he felt it was too low class for them and so on. But they were breaking class boundaries, class barriers. Antonia, do you want to say something?
No, I'm just listening to every word and hanging on every word. I do miss your company and your library and your garden.
I miss you. Right.
I'll come back soon.
And
No, my years in Florence were wonderful learning about all these things.
And Asia, could you introduce yourself, unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Oh, hello. So I have to thank Arjun for inviting me to this conference. I write an art blog. It's called Byron's Muse. And yes, I think everything today is very interesting, but I don't have much commentary because I'm much too nervous to say anything. But I'm especially fascinated by the paintings of Maria Spartelli-Stillman because I don't know much about her art, but I find it very beautiful.
I'm so glad we have you here tonight, Asia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Julia, if I may say so, I would highly recommend her blog, Byron's Muse. It is called Byron's Muse.
Right.
She writes beautifully on painting. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Right.
Thank you.
And who is my daughter-in-law, sort of? And do you want to unmute yourself and make a comment? No. Yes, no, I don't know. But it's wonderful. We've had so many people tonight, experts in their field. Thelma, and those are the experts on the family. And who are also, we've got 5 trollops in our cemetery. So 1, 2, 3, yes, 5. And so this also, the cemetery is extraordinary because so many abolitionists came to Florence because it was a place of freedom. So many artists came for the same reason. And they were idealists in the way that Ruskin is. And it's time we also rebelled the way the Pre-Raphaelites did and insisted on, what was it that Ruskin said? The wealth is not money, it's life. And
there is no wealth but life. The beautiful thing, there is no wealth but life.
And I think if we can live that, it will be close to Quaker ideals too, and so forth. My father came from Quaker background and was a friend and biographer of Gandhi, and was on the Salt March with him because he was an editor for the Times of India and was in Bombay in the 30s. So I grew up never having visited India, but with this great curiosity and love for India. And so I'm so glad that this is happening and plotting this conference and finding these links between India and Florence. So we have spoken for more than an hour, and I think it's probably time to say good night, unless there are more comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, everyone who spoke. Thank you.
Buonanotte.
Buonanotte.
Buonanotte. Dormi bene.
Good night.
Thank